Okay, so here's a thought that should genuinely mess with your head a little. Every primate that has ever been tested on this planet, chimps, gorillas, orangutans, every single monkey species you can name, carries a protein in their blood called the rhesus factor. Every one of them, except for roughly 15% of humans who just don't have it. And the wildest part? After more than 80 years of looking, science still can't tell you why. That's not me being dramatic. That's not some guy on the internet making stuff up to get you to keep watching. That is a real, documented, sitting right there in the textbook's gap in our understanding of human biology. 15% of people are missing something that, as far as we can tell, every other member of the entire primate family tree has been carrying around for millions of years. And if you're one of those people, if you've ever looked at your blood type and seen that little minus sign after the letter, then congratulations. Basically, you are part of one of the strangest unsolved puzzles in human genetics. And look, if this kind of thing scratches an itch in your brain, the weird, the unexplained, the stuff that sounds made up but absolutely isn't, then do yourself a favor and hit subscribe. We post this kind of deep dive every single week. You can even smash that little bell if you want. And yeah, I promise it's worth it. Okay, now that's out of the way, let me actually explain what we're dealing with here, because it gets so much weirder than just a missing protein. So picture this. You go to donate blood, right? Totally normal Tuesday. You roll up your sleeve, somebody pricks your finger, and a few minutes later they hand you a little card that tells you your blood type. A, B, AB, or O. You already knew that part, but there's that second piece, the positive or the negative, the plus or the minus. Most people glance at it, go, huh, neat, and forget about it forever. But that little plus or minus sign is telling you something genuinely strange about your own body, and almost nobody stops to think about what it actually means. That plus or minus is the rhesus factor. And here's the thing. Rhesus isn't some scientist's last name. It's not a Greek word. It's literally named after a monkey, the rhesus macaque to be specific. And the reason it's named after a monkey is the whole reason this story even exists. So let me take you back to where it all started, because the discovery itself is half the mystery. The year is 1940. You're in a lab. The world is on fire. World War II is raging across Europe. But inside this quiet research building, two scientists named Carl Landsteiner and Alexander Wiener are doing something that, on the surface, sounds incredibly boring. They're taking blood from rhesus monkeys, injecting it into rabbits and guinea pigs, and watching what happens. Landsteiner, by the way, wasn't some nobody. This was the guy who had already discovered the basic ABO blood group system decades earlier. The discovery that made blood transfusions actually safe instead of a coin flip between living and dying. The man won a Nobel Prize for it. So when this guy starts poking around in blood, you pay attention. Here's what they were doing. When you inject one animal's blood into another animal, the second animal's immune system freaks out. It sees these foreign blood cells and goes, nope, intruder, kill it. And it builds these little proteins called antibodies that latch onto the invading cells and clump them together. That clumping is the immune system's way of flagging something as the enemy. Pretty standard stuff. So they took the antibodies that the rabbits had built up against rhesus monkey blood, and then, and this is the clever part, they started dripping those antibodies onto samples of human blood, just to see what would happen. And here's where it gets good. When they dripped those monkey blood antibodies onto human blood samples, about 85% of them reacted. The blood clumped. It clotted up into these visible little clusters, which meant that 85% of humans had something on their red blood cells that was similar enough to the monkey's rhesus protein that the antibodies recognized it and attacked. Makes sense, right? We're primates. Monkeys are primates. Of course we'd share this stuff. But then there was the other 15%. When they dripped those same antibodies onto the other 15% of human samples, nothing happened. Nothing. The blood just sat there. no clumping, no reaction, no nothing. It was as if the protein the antibodies were looking for simply wasn't there. The cells were, in the words that got passed down through the science, completely invisible, as if those red blood cells weren't even there to be attacked. The antibodies swept through looking for their target and found absolutely nothing to grab onto. And that's the moment. That's the exact moment in 1940 that humanity discovered that a chunk of our own species is walking around missing something the rest of us have. The 85% who reacted got labeled Rh positive, rhesus positive. They've got the protein. And the 15% whose blood stayed invisible got labeled Rh negative, no rhesus protein. And that little discovery is the reason your blood card has a plus or a minus on it to this day. Now, here's the part that I really need you to sit with for a second, because this is where the whole thing tips over from interesting trivia into, wait, hold on, that doesn't make sense. When you find a trait in humans, any trait, the default assumption in biology is that it came from somewhere. It evolved, it served a purpose, or at the very least, it's a leftover from something our ancestors had. And almost every trait we have, you can trace back through the primate family tree. 5 fingers, shared with primates. Color vision, shared with primates. The basic structure of your blood, shared with primates. But the absence of the rhesus protein, that's the weird one. Because we tested the chimps, we tested the gorillas, we tested the orangutans, the bonobos, the gibbons. Every species of monkey researchers could get their hands on. And every single one of them, without exception, carries the rhesus protein. All of them are, in a sense, Rh positive. The protein is universal across the primate world. It's so consistent, so fundamental, that it's basically a defining feature of being a primate. Except for that 15% of humans. We are the only primates on Earth where a significant portion of the population is just missing it. And nobody, and I mean nobody, not in 1940, not now, not after 80+ years of genetics getting absurdly sophisticated, nobody can give you a clean, satisfying answer for why. Why would a protein that every other primate kept around for millions of years suddenly vanish in a slice of humanity? What pressure made it disappear? What advantage did losing it give? And the honest answer from science is a shrug. We don't actually know. Let me explain why that's such a big deal, because if you don't have a background in this stuff, it might just sound like a minor footnote. In evolution, traits don't usually just disappear for no reason. There's almost always a story. Either the trait stopped being useful and slowly faded out because there was no pressure to keep it, or, and this is the more interesting case, actively getting rid of the trait gave some kind of survival advantage, so the people without it had more babies and the trait spread. So when you find a trait spread across 15% of all of humanity, the natural question is, okay, what's the advantage? What did these people get for losing the rhesus protein? And here's the thing that breaks your brain. Not only is there no obvious advantage, but having Rh negative blood actually comes with a pretty serious downside. A downside so severe that by all the rules of evolution, this trait should have been wiped out a long, long time ago. But it wasn't. It's still here in 15% of us. And I'm going to get to exactly why that's such a paradox in a minute, because it's honestly the strangest part of the whole story. But first, let me hit you with something even stranger about where these people are. Because if Rh negative blood were just some random genetic quirk, you'd expect it to be spread pretty evenly around the world. Random mutations, random distribution, right? A little bit here, a little bit there, roughly the same everywhere. That is not what we see at all. The distribution of Rh negative blood across the human population is suspiciously, almost weirdly, non-random. And there's one spot on the map that lights up like a flare. I want you to picture the border region between northern Spain and southern France. Up in the corner there, tucked against the Atlantic coast and the Pyrenees Mountains, there's a group of people called the Basques. And the Basques are already one of the most genuinely mysterious populations in all of Europe, before we even get to their blood. Here's why the Basques are weird in their own right. Their language, Basque, or Euskara as they call it, is what linguists call a language isolate. That means it is not related to any other language on Earth. Not to Spanish, not to French, not to English, not to Latin, not to any of the Indo-European languages that blanket the entire rest of the continent. It's not related to anything. It just exists on its own, with no detectable relatives, which strongly suggests these people have been sitting in that corner of the world, relatively isolated, for an extraordinarily long time. Long enough to have outlasted the waves of migration that overwrote everybody else's languages. The Basques are, in a real sense, a window into a much older Europe, a remnant of who was there before everyone else showed up. And here's the kicker. Among people of Basque descent, the rate of Rh-negative blood isn't the usual 15%. It's nearly 30%, double the global average. In some specific Basque populations, the numbers run even higher than that. This is the single highest concentration of Rh-negative blood found in any population on the planet. And it shows up in the exact group of people who are also genetically and linguistically the most isolated, the most ancient, the most left over from before of anyone in Europe. That is what one researcher called the signature of something we don't understand. Because think about what that pattern is telling you. If Rh-negative blood concentrates in the oldest, most isolated population, the people who kept to themselves and didn't blend with the later arrivals, then that suggests the Rh-negative trait might actually be the older trait, the original. And the Rh-positive blood that most of humanity carries? That might be the thing that spread later, washing over the continent and diluting the Rh-negative population everywhere, except in that one isolated corner where the old bloodline held on. Now, I want to be careful here. That's one interpretation, and we'll get into the others. But the geography is real. The numbers are real. The Basque 30% is documented fact, and it is screaming at us that something specific happened in human history, something we have not figured out yet. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting, because the Basques aren't the only hotspot. The general pattern across Europe is that Rh-negative blood is most common in Western Europe and gets rarer and rarer the further east and the further into Asia you go. Among people of European descent broadly, you're looking at that 15–16% range. But travel east into the populations of East Asia, and the rate of Rh-negative blood plummets to something like 1% or even lower. In some East Asian populations, it's so rare it's barely there at all. And among many indigenous populations of the Americas and large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the rate is also extremely low. So the trait isn't just non-random, it's geographically clustered in a way that points like an arrow at Western Europe, and specifically at that ancient Basque corner as some kind of epicenter. And whenever you see a genetic trait that's concentrated in one geographic region and fades out as you move away from it, that's a clue. That's the kind of pattern that usually means the trait originated in or near that region and then spread outward, getting thinner the further it traveled from home. So if you follow that logic, the heart of the Rh-negative mystery sits right there in the western edge of Europe, in the land of a people whose language is related to nothing else on Earth. And again, nobody can fully explain why. Let me explain the leading attempts, because this is where the theories start getting genuinely wild. But before we get to the theories, I have to set up the paradox, because the theories only make sense once you understand just how much this trait should not exist. So here it is. Here's the pregnancy paradox that, frankly, breaks evolution. And this is the part where the Rh negative thing stops being a fun fact and becomes legitimately one of the strangest things about human biology. Imagine you're an Rh negative woman. Your blood doesn't have the rhesus protein. And let's say you fall in love with an Rh positive man, which, statistically, is most men, since 85% of people are Rh positive. The two of you have a baby. Now, because Rh positive is the dominant trait, there's a very good chance that baby is going to be Rh positive too. The baby inherits the rhesus protein from dad. So now you've got an Rh negative mother carrying an Rh positive baby. A mother whose blood has no rhesus protein growing a child whose blood does. And here's the horror of it. During pregnancy, and especially during birth, some of the baby's blood can mix with the mother's blood. And when that happens, when the mother's Rh negative immune system encounters the baby's Rh positive blood cells with that foreign rhesus protein on them, her body does exactly what an immune system is built to do. It sees that protein, the one it's never encountered before, the one it doesn't recognize as self, and it goes intruder. It treats her own baby's blood as a foreign invader, and it starts building antibodies to destroy it. Let that sink in for a second. The mother's body can attack her own child. It can treat the baby growing inside her like an infection to be eliminated. This condition has a name. It's called rhesus disease, or hemolytic disease of the newborn. And before modern medicine figured out how to handle it, it was a catastrophe. Here's how it usually played out. The first Rh positive baby is often fine because it takes time for the mother's immune system to get sensitized and ramp up its antibody production. And the major mixing of blood frequently happens during the birth itself. So baby number 1 slips through. But now the mother is sensitized. Her immune system has now learned the rhesus protein. It's primed. And so the next Rh positive baby, her immune system is ready and waiting. It launches antibodies across the placenta that attack and destroy the baby's red blood cells. The baby can develop severe anemia, jaundice, brain damage, and in the worst cases, the pregnancy ends in miscarriage or the baby dies. For generations, for thousands of years, this was just a tragic mystery. Women who could have one healthy child and then a string of babies who didn't survive, with nobody understanding why. Now here's why this is a paradox that should genuinely keep evolutionary biologists up at night. Evolution is brutal, and it is simple at its core. Traits that help you have surviving children spread, and traits that hurt your ability to have surviving children get weeded out. That's the whole game. Reproduction is the entire scoreboard. So a trait that actively makes it harder to have healthy babies, a trait where a mother's own body might destroy her second, third, fourth child. That is, by the cold logic of natural selection, exactly the kind of trait that should get eliminated. Hard. Fast. It should have been pruned out of the human gene pool a long, long time ago. The Rh negative mothers should, over many generations, have had fewer surviving children than the Rh positive mothers, and the trait should have slowly bled out of existence. But it didn't. It's still here. 15% of humanity, 30% of the Basques. A trait that works against childbirth that should have been crushed by natural selection has not only survived, but persisted at remarkably high levels in entire populations for what appears to be a very, very long time. And that, right there, is the central knot of the whole mystery. How does a trait that hurts reproduction survive? Either there's some hidden advantage to being Rh negative that's strong enough to outweigh the pregnancy danger, some benefit we haven't identified, or there's something about the origin of this trait that doesn't fit the normal evolutionary story at all. And it's that second possibility, that little crack in the explanation, that the theories rush in to fill. So let me walk you through the theories, because they escalate, and I mean they escalate fast. We're going to start at the boring, respectable, scientific end of the spectrum, and we're going to slide all the way down to the stuff that gets whispered about on the strange corners of the internet. And I want to be straight with you the whole way. I'll tell you which ones the mainstream takes seriously and which ones are pure speculation. But all of them exist because that paradox I just described leaves a hole, and human beings cannot stand a hole in a story. Theory number 1, the most scientifically grounded one, the mutation explanation. The straightforward, no-drama version of events is that at some point in the past, in some population, a genetic mutation occurred that switched off the gene responsible for making the rhesus protein. The rhesus protein, by the way, sits on the surface of your red blood cells, and the genes that control it are real, identified pieces of DNA. There's a gene called Rhd that's basically the master switch, and in most Rh-negative people of European descent, that entire Rhd gene is simply deleted, gone, missing from the chromosome. So the protein never gets built because the instructions for building it were erased. Under this theory, that deletion happened somewhere by chance in some ancestral group, and then, and here's the part the theory has to explain, it spread. And the way it could spread without any advantage at all is through something called genetic drift, especially in a small, isolated population. Picture a tiny, isolated group of people, maybe a few hundred, cut off in some mountain valley. In a small group, random luck plays a huge role. If just by chance the Rh-negative individuals happened to have more surviving children for reasons that had nothing to do with their blood, better luck, better territory, whatever, the trait could become common in that little group purely by accident. And if that small, isolated group later expanded or became the founding stock of a larger population, then the Rh-negative trait would be overrepresented in everyone who descended from them. This is called a founder effect. A quirk of one small ancestral group gets amplified and carried forward into millions of descendants. And you'll notice, this theory fits the Basques beautifully. An ancient, isolated population, tucked away in the mountains, speaking a language related to nothing, carrying a blood trait at double the normal rate. That's exactly what you'd expect from a founder effect followed by isolation. So this is the explanation most mainstream scientists lean on. It doesn't require any magic, any aliens, any lost civilizations. Just a mutation, a small population, and a lot of time. But, and this is the crucial but, it still doesn't fully solve the paradox. Genetic drift can spread a neutral trait, sure. But Rh-negative blood isn't neutral. It carries that real reproductive cost in mixed pregnancies. So even with the founder effect, you've got to explain how the trait held on for so long against that constant downward pressure of natural selection. The mutation theory tells you how it could have appeared and spread. It struggles to tell you why it hasn't faded. And that lingering gap is the doorway that all the other theories walk through. Which brings us to theory number 2. And this one has actually gotten serious scientific attention over the years, the Neanderthal connection. Now, here's something that, if you didn't already know it, is going to be a fun one. If you are of European or Asian descent, you almost certainly have Neanderthal DNA in you right now. This is not fringe stuff. This is rock-solid, settled science. When modern humans migrated out of Africa tens of thousands of years ago, they ran into the Neanderthals, who were already living across Europe and parts of Asia. And our ancestors didn't just compete with them or fight them, they interbred with them. They had children together, and those children had children. And so, a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, usually somewhere around 1 to 4%, got woven permanently into the genomes of non-African humans. You are, in a very literal sense, part Neanderthal. So am I. Most people watching this are. So the theory goes like this. What if the Rh-negative trait, or some piece of the genetics behind it, came from the Neanderthals? What if it's a Neanderthal inheritance, a leftover from a population of ancient humans who were similar to us, but not quite the same as us? It's a genuinely tempting idea. It would explain why the trait shows up where it does, geographically, since the regions with high Rh-negative rates overlap with regions of significant Neanderthal ancestry. And it slots right into that creepy feeling the whole thing gives off, the sense that Rh-negative people are carrying something a little bit other, a little bit not quite modern human. Now, I have to be honest with you here, because the channel rule is we don't make stuff up. The hard genetic evidence linking the specific Rh-negative trait directly to Neanderthals is actually pretty murky. The Neanderthal genome has been sequenced, and the picture of rhesus genetics in ancient humans is complicated. It's not a clean, the Neanderthals were Rh-negative and gave it to us story. Some researchers have looked into it, and the relationship between ancient hominin blood groups and modern ones turns out to be tangled. So this theory is more of a compelling possibility than a proven fact. But the reason it sticks around, the reason people keep coming back to it, is that it captures the real, documented truth at the heart of all this, which is that we modern humans are not a single clean lineage. We are a mix. We are a blend of different ancient human populations, including ones that aren't around anymore. And once you accept that there's literally Neanderthal in your blood, the idea that some of our weirdest traits came from those vanished cousins stops sounding crazy and starts sounding almost obvious. The Neanderthal theory is the bridge. It's the last theory that's still standing firmly on scientific ground while pointing towards something stranger. And on the other side of that bridge, things get a lot less scientific. Now, before we cross that bridge, let me give you theory number 3, which is sort of a sibling of the founder effect idea, but with a darker flavor: the plague survivor theory. The idea here is that maybe Rh-negative blood, despite its reproductive downside, came with a hidden upside, specifically resistance to some ancient disease. This is actually a pretty respectable idea in principle, because we know for a fact that some blood traits do protect against diseases. The classic example is sickle cell. Carrying one copy of the sickle cell gene protects you against malaria, which is exactly why it persisted in regions where malaria was rampant, despite the fact that 2 copies cause a serious illness. That's a trait with a real cost that survived because it came with a real benefit against a deadly disease. So the question becomes, could Rh-negative blood have done something similar? Could it have offered protection against some plague, some epidemic that swept through ancient Europe and killed Rh-positive people at higher rates, leaving the Rh-negative survivors to repopulate and pass on their trait? It's a clean idea. It would explain how a trait with a reproductive cost could survive. The protection against the plague would have outweighed the pregnancy danger, at least during the times when the plague was killing people. Some researchers have speculated about exactly this, pointing to the great waves of disease that have torn through human populations over the millennia. The trouble is, nobody has actually identified the specific disease. It's a beautiful mechanism with a missing villain. We know how a disease could have shaped the trait, we just don't have the disease. So it remains a theory, plausible, mechanistically sound, but unproven. And like the founder effect, it explains the survival of the trait without quite explaining everything about it. The hole stays open just a crack. And now we cross the bridge. Because once you've got an unexplained trait, a paradox that breaks the normal rules, a suspicious geographic clustering, and a tantalizing connection to vanished ancient humans, you have all the raw ingredients for the theories to escalate way past the boundaries of mainstream science. And escalate they do. Here's where the theories climb up into the realm of the ancient and the strange, because some people look at all of this, the missing protein, the immune system that rejects its own offspring, the isolated bloodlines, the connection to populations that were not quite us, and they draw a very different conclusion. They say, what if Rh-negative people aren't fully descended from the same line as everyone else? What if that 15% carries the trace of a bloodline that wasn't entirely human? And this is the point where you might be thinking, okay, now this guy's lost it, right? You'd call me crazy. Well, you're not alone in thinking that, but stay with me, because I'm not telling you this stuff is true. I'm telling you it exists, that these are real theories that real people have built around this very real mystery. And the reason they exist is fascinating in itself. The mind reaches for these explanations precisely because the official explanation has that hole in it. When science says we don't fully know, human beings rush to fill the silence with stories. And the stories that fill the Rh-negative silence are some of the wildest out there. The escalation goes something like this. First, you've got the relatively tame version, the idea of isolated ancient bloodlines, small populations of early humans who were genetically distinct, who kept to themselves, and whose unusual blood marks them out even today as the descendants of a separate, older line. That's basically a dressed-up version of the founder effect, and it's not unreasonable. But it doesn't stop there. From isolated bloodlines, the theory escalates to the claim that these weren't just isolated humans, but populations that were not quite human. Beings that were similar to us, that could interbreed with us, but that came from somewhere or something else. And the most dramatic version of this reaches all the way back into ancient texts. Some people connect Rh-negative blood to the Nephilim, a name that appears in old religious texts, describing a race of beings, sometimes translated as giants, sometimes described as the offspring of unions between the divine and the human, a kind of hybrid lineage that walked the earth in ancient times. The theory, in its fullest and wildest form, is that the Rh-negative trait is the genetic fingerprint of that hybrid bloodline, a marker left in the blood of their descendants, persisting down through thousands of years, surfacing today in that mysterious 15%. Now look, I want to be crystal clear, because the whole point of this channel is that the truth is wild enough on its own without us pretending fairy tales are facts. There is no scientific evidence whatsoever for the Nephilim theory. None. It is not supported by genetics. It is not supported by archaeology. It lives entirely in the realm of speculation and ancient mythology. But here's what I find genuinely fascinating about it, and why it's worth your time to understand rather than just laugh at. The Nephilim theory exists because the real mystery is real. People didn't invent the strangeness of Rh-negative blood. The strangeness is documented. The missing protein, the mother attacking her own child, the impossible survival of a harmful trait, the suspicious Bass clustering. All of that is true. And when you hand human beings a true mystery with a hole in the middle of it, this is what they build. They build bridges from the documented strange all the way out to the mythological strange, because the documented strange feels like it's pointing at something, and the human mind cannot resist following that finger all the way to the horizon. The Nephilim theory isn't evidence about blood, it's evidence about us, about how desperately we want the unexplained to mean something. And that brings us to maybe the most deliciously suggestive angle of the entire story, the one that sits right on the knife's edge between documented history and pure speculation: the royal connection, the blue bloods. Because here's a pattern that is, at the very least, a genuinely strange coincidence, and at the most, a hint that some of history's most powerful families might have known something about their own genetics that the rest of us are only now puzzling over. You've heard the phrase blue blood, right? It's the old term for aristocracy, for royalty, for the noble families of Europe. The phrase itself supposedly comes from the fact that pale-skinned nobles who never had to work outdoors had skin so fair you could see the bluish tint of the veins underneath, blue blood as a mark of not being a sun-beaten laborer. But the deeper you dig into the actual biology of Europe's royal families, the more you find some genuinely odd things clustering in those bloodlines. And two of those things are the ones that matter for our story. The first is hemophilia. Hemophilia is a genetic disorder where the blood doesn't clot properly. even a small injury can lead to dangerous, uncontrolled bleeding. And it ran like a curse through the royal houses of Europe. The most famous carrier of all was Queen Victoria of Britain, who reigned over the British Empire at its peak in the 1800s. Queen Victoria was a carrier of the hemophilia gene, and because her children and grandchildren married into royal families all across the continent, Spain, Germany, Russia, she spread that gene through the interconnected web of European royalty. It became so notorious that hemophilia got nicknamed the royal disease. The most tragic and famous example is the Russian royal family, the Romanovs. The young heir, Alexei, the son of the last Tsar, suffered terribly from hemophilia, and his mother's desperate search for anyone who could help her son is part of how the infamous Rasputin gained his terrifying influence over the Russian court, which fed into the chaos that helped bring down the entire empire. So this isn't fringe trivia. The clustering of a rare blood disorder in Europe's royal families is documented, world history-altering fact. And here's the second thing, the part that ties it back to us. Alongside the hemophilia, Europe's aristocratic families have been reported to carry unusually high rates of Rh-negative blood. The very same families, the same intermarried web of blue bloods, showing both an unusual concentration of a rare bleeding disorder and an unusual concentration of the rare Rh-negative trait. And so the question that some people can't help but ask is that just a coincidence? Or did these families, who were obsessed, genuinely obsessed, with bloodlines and lineage and purity, who kept meticulous family trees going back centuries, who married within an incredibly tight circle to keep their bloodline pure, did they know something? Did they understand, in some intuitive or even deliberate way, that their blood was different? That they carried something distinct in their veins that set them apart from the common population they ruled over? Now, the sober explanation here is actually pretty solid, and I'm not going to hide it from you because it's important. The reason rare blood traits cluster in royal families is almost certainly inbreeding. European royalty married within an extremely small pool. Cousins married cousins. Families intertwined over and over for generations to keep power and property within the dynasty. And when you breed within a small, closed population, rare genetic traits get concentrated and amplified exactly the way they do in any small, isolated group. That's the same founder effect and isolation principle we talked about with the Basques, just driven by social rules instead of geography. The hemophilia spread through the royal houses because of intermarriage, and the elevated Rh-negative rates could be explained the same way. A small, closed breeding population concentrating an uncommon trait. No conspiracy required. No secret knowledge. Just the mathematics of a gene pool that was kept artificially tiny by the politics of power. But, and you knew there was a but, the suggestive part doesn't fully go away. And here's why. There's something undeniably poetic, almost eerie, about the fact that the families who built their entire identity around the idea that their blood was special, that they were a breed apart, that they were born to rule by the virtue of their lineage, that those exact families turn out to actually have unusual blood. They told a story about themselves for 1,000 years, a story about pure and special bloodlines. And then modern science comes along and finds that their blood genuinely was, by the numbers, unusual. Was it self-fulfilling? The inbreeding creating the very distinctiveness they bragged about? Almost certainly. But you can see how, to someone staring at this pattern, it starts to feel like the myth and the biology are circling each other, each one whispering that maybe, just maybe, there was a kernel of literal truth buried inside all that talk of noble blood. And that's the kind of coincidence that, even when you know the rational explanation, gives you a little chill. The blue bloods called their blood special, and it turns out, in a strictly genetic sense, they weren't entirely wrong. So let me pull all of this together because I want you to feel the full shape of the mystery before we go any further. Step back and look at everything we've laid out. You've got a protein, the rhesus factor, that is so fundamental to being a primate that every single non-human primate ever tested carries it. And then you've got humans, the odd ones out, with 15% of us mysteriously missing it. You've got a discovery in 1940 where antibodies from monkey blood lit up 85% of human samples and left the other 15% invisible, like ghosts. You've got a distribution that refuses to be random, clustering in Western Europe, spiking to nearly 30% among the ancient, isolated, language isolate Basques, and fading away to almost nothing as you travel east into Asia. You've got a paradox that should not exist, a trait that can turn a mother's body against her own unborn child, a trait with a brutal reproductive cost that by every rule of evolution should have been erased, and yet it stubbornly, impossibly persists. And you've got a cascade of theories, from the respectable founder effect and Neanderthal and plague survivor explanations, all the way up to ancient bloodlines, not quite human ancestors, the Nephilim of old texts, and the strange clustering of unusual blood in the royal families who always insisted their blood was special. And the thing that ties every single piece of this together, the thread running through all of it, is that hole in the explanation. Science can tell you what Rh-negative blood is. It can tell you the gene that's deleted, the protein that's missing, the medical consequences, the geographic spread. It can give you mechanisms, drift, founder effects, possible disease resistance that could account for parts of the puzzle. But it cannot give you the full, clean, satisfying story of why. Why it vanished. Why it survived despite hurting reproduction. Why it concentrates where it does. There's a genuine, honest gap in our knowledge, and that gap is exactly why this topic has fascinated people for over 80 years and refuses to let go. Now, here's what I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we go forward, because there's a lot more to unpack. Notice the structure of this whole thing. At the center, you have a small core of hard, undeniable facts. The missing protein, the monkey antibody test, the Basque 30%, the pregnancy danger, the deleted RHD gene. These are not in dispute, they are textbook. And then, radiating outward from that hard core, you have layer after layer of explanation, each one a little less certain than the last, each one filling in a little more of the gap with a little less evidence, until at the very outer edge you reach pure myth. And the journey from the center to the edge, from every primate has this protein to the Nephilim walked the earth, is one continuous chain. Each link feels like it follows from the one before it. That's what makes this topic so seductive and so slippery at the same time. You start with cold, hard, documented science, and if you're not careful, the momentum of the mystery carries you all the way out past the edge of the map. And here's the honest truth. The thing that turns out to be the most interesting part of all, the science, the real science, is plenty strange on its own. You do not need the Nephilim to make Rh-negative blood astonishing. The plain facts are astonishing. A part of our own species is walking around missing something every other primate has. A mother's immune system can mistake her own baby for an invader. A harmful trait has clung to existence for who knows how long against the relentless pressure of natural selection. An ancient people whose language is related to nothing on Earth carry this trait at double the global rate. Those things are real, they are documented, and they are genuinely unexplained. The wildest theories aren't filling a boring void. They're trying to make sense of a void that is already, all by itself, one of the strangest things about being human. So where does that leave you? Sitting there with your blood card and its little plus or minus sign. If you're Rh positive, you're in the 85%. You've got the protein that links you back through the whole primate family tree, the one chimps and gorillas and every monkey shares. And if you're Rh negative, You're part of that 15% that science still can't fully account for, carrying, in a very literal sense, an open question in your own veins. Either way, the next time someone glances at that little symbol and says, "Oh neat, you're A positive," or, "Huh, you're O negative," you'll know that little plus or minus is a doorway. Behind it is a mystery that runs from a quiet lab in 1940, through the isolated mountain valleys of the Basques, into the immune system's strange war against unborn children, across the tangled inheritance of vanished Neanderthals, and all the way out to the bloodlines of kings who swore they were a breed apart. And we've barely scratched the surface of just how deep this rabbit hole goes. Okay, so where we left off, you were sitting there with your blood card, staring at that little plus or minus sign, and I told you it was a doorway. So let's actually walk through that doorway now, because the deeper you go, the stranger the architecture gets. And I want to start by going back to the science, the hard, documented, can't argue with it science. Because there are details about how this whole thing actually works at the cellular level that make the mystery even sharper. Not fuzzier, sharper. So let me explain what's actually happening on the surface of your red blood cells. Because once you understand this, the whole missing protein thing stops being abstract and becomes genuinely vivid. Picture one of your red blood cells. It's this little disc, slightly caved in on both sides like a tiny squished donut without the hole going all the way through. And the surface of that cell isn't smooth and bare. It's studded with all kinds of molecules sticking out of it, like decorations on a Christmas ornament. Some of those molecules are proteins, some are sugars, and together they form a kind of identity badge. They tell your immune system, hey, this is one of ours, leave it alone. Your A, B, O blood type? That's determined by certain sugar molecules sitting on that surface. And the rhesus factor, the thing we've been talking about this whole time, is a protein that sits on that same surface, embedded in the cell membrane. Now here's the detail that I find genuinely wild. The rhesus protein isn't just decoration, it actually does something. For a long time, people kind of treated it as a mysterious surface marker with no obvious job, like, why is it even there? But research has increasingly pointed to the rhesus proteins playing a role in transporting things across the cell membrane, possibly involved in moving gases like ammonia or carbon dioxide, and in maintaining the structure and integrity of the red blood cell itself. The cells of people who are missing the entire rhesus complex, and there's an extremely rare condition called Rh null, where a person is missing not just a D protein, but the entire family of rhesus proteins. Those people's red blood cells are actually subtly deformed. They're more fragile. They can have a mild, lifelong anemia. Their cells don't hold their shape quite as well. So the protein matters. It's not just a label, it's load-bearing. And that, by the way, makes the Rh null condition one of the rarest and strangest things in all of human biology. So let me detour into it for a second, because it's earned the nickname golden blood, and once you hear why, you'll understand. Rh null blood is blood that has none of the rhesus antigens at all. Not the D, not any of the others, completely blank in the rhesus department. And it is staggeringly rare. We're talking about a condition so uncommon that, over the entire history of blood research, only a tiny handful of people on the entire planet have ever been identified with it. A few dozen. In the whole world. Across all of recorded medical history. And here's why it's called golden blood. And here's the part that's both beautiful and terrifying. Because Rh null blood has none of those rhesus antigens on it, it can be safely given to almost anyone with a rare blood type within the rhesus system. It's an incredibly precious, universal-ish donor resource for people with rare blood needs. It's like liquid gold for transfusion medicine. That's the beautiful part. But now here's the terrifying flip side. If a person who has Rh null blood ever needs a transfusion themselves, say they're in a car accident, they're bleeding out, they need blood right now, They can basically only receive Rh null blood. Their immune system has never seen any rhesus antigen, so virtually any normal donated blood would trigger a catastrophic reaction. And since there are only a few dozen Rh null donors on Earth, and they're scattered across different countries, an Rh null person who needs blood in an emergency is in genuine, life-threatening danger. They are walking around with the most generous blood on the planet and the most demanding blood on the planet at the same time. Some of these people have been asked to bank their own blood, to donate regularly so it can be frozen and stored, because they are quite literally a global medical resource. Imagine that. Imagine being told that your blood is so rare that the entire planet needs you to keep donating it, and also that if you ever get hurt, that same rarity could kill you. That's golden blood. And it's a useful reminder, as we go deeper, that the rhesus system is not some trivial little quirk. It's a deep, structural, consequential part of human biology, and the variations in it have real, dramatic stakes. Now let me bring it back to the main mystery, because understanding that the rhesus protein actually does a job makes the disappearance even harder to explain. Think about it. If the protein were truly useless, just a meaningless decoration, then losing it would be no big deal, and you could imagine it drifting away in some populations without consequence. But the protein isn't useless. It contributes to the health and structure of your red blood cells. So losing it isn't free. It's a trade. And when evolution makes a trade, when a population gives up something useful, there's usually a reason. There's usually something gained on the other side of the ledger. So what did Rh-negative people gain in exchange for giving up a functional, structurally useful protein? That's the question that won't go away. That's the ledger that won't balance. And here's where I want to take you somewhere specific, because there's a piece of this that connects directly back to that pregnancy paradox I laid out before. And it's a piece that turns the tragedy of rhesus disease into one of the great triumphs of modern medicine. And along the way, it deepens the mystery instead of solving it. So let me explain how we actually beat rhesus disease, because it's a genuinely incredible story. Remember the setup: an Rh-negative mother, an Rh-positive baby, the mother's immune system building antibodies to attack the child. For thousands of years, this was an invisible killer. Women would have one healthy baby and then a string of losses, and nobody understood the pattern. It was just one of those cruel mysteries of life and death that families absorbed without explanation. And then, in the middle of the 20th century, after that 1940 discovery cracked open the whole rhesus system, doctors finally understood the mechanism. They understood that it was the mother's immune response to the foreign rhesus protein that was doing the damage. And once you understand a mechanism, you can start to think about how to interrupt it. The solution they came up with is, honestly, one of the most elegant tricks in all of medicine. It's a treatment, an injection, given to Rh-negative mothers, usually during the pregnancy and again shortly after birth. And here's the clever part. The injection contains antibodies against the rhesus protein. Wait, you might be thinking, antibodies against the rhesus protein are the whole problem? Why would you inject more of them? Here's the genius of it. These injected antibodies swoop in and grab onto any of the baby's Rh-positive blood cells that have leaked into the mother's bloodstream, and they destroy and clear those cells away before the mother's own immune system gets a chance to notice them, study them, and learn to make its own antibodies. It's like a cleanup crew that erases the evidence before the alarm system can register that an intruder was ever there. The mother's immune system never gets sensitized. It never learns the rhesus protein. And so the next pregnancy and the one after that are protected. The mother's body never declares war on her children because it never found out there was anything to fight. This treatment, which became widely available in the late 1960s, has saved an absolutely staggering number of babies. It turned what used to be a leading cause of newborn death and disability into something that, in places with good medical care, is now rare and manageable. It is one of the quiet, unsung miracles of modern medicine. And I want you to sit with how recent that is. For the entire span of human history, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, Rh-negative mothers and their later Rh-positive babies were at the mercy of this biological landmine. It is only in the last 60 or so years, a blink, that we figured out how to diffuse it. And here's why that matters for the mystery. Here's the part that makes your brain itch all over again. That treatment is new. It has existed for a few decades, which means for the entire deep history of the Rh-negative trait, all the thousands and thousands of years it was spreading through the Basques and clustering in Western Europe and persisting at 15% of humanity, the pregnancy penalty was fully in effect, with no medicine to soften it. The brutal arithmetic of natural selection had every opportunity over countless generations to grind this trait down to nothing. And it didn't. The trait sailed straight through all of that and arrived in the 20th century still going strong. So the medical triumph, as wonderful as it is, doesn't explain the survival of the trait. If anything, it underlines just how impressive and unexplained that survival is. We saved the babies only in the last 60 years. The trait survived the previous 50,000 on its own. How? So let me come back to that question. What did Rh-negative people gain? And dig into it harder. Because there have been some genuinely interesting attempts to find the hidden advantage, and they're worth knowing about even when they don't fully land. Because remember, the plague survivor idea I mentioned before is just one flavor of a broader hunt. The broader hunt is this. Scientists have long suspected that the Rh-negative trait must come with some compensating benefit, some way that being Rh-negative helped people survive or reproduce that was strong enough to offset the pregnancy cost. And researchers have gone looking for it in a few different directions. One direction is disease resistance, which I touched on. The logic is the sickle cell logic. A trait with a real cost survives because it shields you from something even deadlier. People have wondered whether Rh-negative status, or the genetics tangled up with it, might offer some protection against certain infections or parasites. The challenge, again, is that no clear smoking gun has been found. There have been studies and speculations connecting rhesus status to susceptibility or resistance to various things. There's even been research suggesting rhesus status might interact in subtle ways with a common parasite called Toxoplasma gondii, the one famously associated with cats, affecting things like reaction times and the effects of infection. Some studies have suggested that Rh-positive people might be somewhat protected against certain negative effects of that parasite, while Rh-negative people might be more vulnerable, which, if anything, would be an argument against Rh-negative, not for it, deepening the puzzle of why the trait persists. But I want to be careful here, because this is an area where the research is genuinely contested and the findings have gone back and forth, so I'm not going to tell you it's settled. What I'll tell you is the honest state of things. People have been hunting for the hidden advantage of Rh-negative blood for decades, and they keep finding hints, threads, suggestions, and nothing they can nail down as the answer. The advantage, if it exists, has been remarkably good at hiding. And that persistent failure to find the advantage is itself a kind of data point, and it's one of the reasons the topic stays so magnetic. Because in science, when you have a trait that obviously costs something and you cannot find what it pays back, you're left with a few uncomfortable options. Maybe the advantage existed in the past, in some environment or against some disease that no longer exists, so we literally cannot observe it anymore. The benefit is a ghost, gone with the conditions that created it. Or maybe there is no advantage, and the trait genuinely is just a quirk that got lucky through drift and founder effects and managed to ride along despite its cost. Or maybe, and this is the door that the wilder theories love, maybe the trait doesn't fit the normal model at all, because its origin is something we haven't properly accounted for. Each of those options leaves you unsatisfied in a different way. And human beings really, really don't like being unsatisfied by a mystery. We'd rather have a wrong answer than no answer. Which again, is exactly why the theories proliferate. Now, I promised you we'd go deeper down the rabbit hole, so let me circle back to the geography, because there's more to that map than just the Basques, and the fuller picture is even more suggestive. We talked about how Rh-negative blood is concentrated in Western Europe, and how it spikes among the Basques. But let me give you the wider landscape, because the pattern, when you zoom out, has this strange, almost deliberate-looking shape to it. Start in Western Europe, the Basque region as the white-hot center, nearly 30%. Move outward into the rest of Europe, and the rate settles into that 15–16% band that's become the default we associate with the trait. Now travel south and east. As you move into the Middle East, the rates start dropping. Push further east into Central Asia, and they keep dropping. Reach East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and the rate of Rh-negative blood collapses to around 1%, sometimes even less. In some East Asian populations, it's so rare that being Rh-negative is a genuine medical concern, because finding compatible blood for a transfusion or managing an Rh-negative pregnancy becomes much harder simply because there are so few Rh-negative people around to donate. Now swing the other way. Among many of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, before mixing with European populations, the rate of Rh-negative blood was extremely low, in many groups, essentially zero. And across much of sub-Saharan Africa, the rate is also relatively low compared to Europe, though it varies. So what does that map look like when you step back? It looks like a trait with a clear epicenter in Western Europe, radiating outward and thinning as it goes, almost vanishing at the far edges of human geographic expansion. And that shape, that radiating from a center shape, is exactly what you'd expect from a trait that arose in or near that Western European corner, or was carried there by some founding population, and then spread outward through migration and intermarriage, getting more and more diluted the further it got from its origin point. The Basques, sitting in their isolated mountain stronghold, preserved the highest concentration because they mixed the least. Everybody else got progressively more blended with Rh-positive populations the further you travel from that core. It's a beautiful, coherent geographic story, and it points, like a giant arrow drawn across the map of the world, straight back at that one ancient, mysterious corner of the European continent. But here's the thing the arrow doesn't tell you, and this is the gap again, always the gap. The arrow tells you where the trait is concentrated. It does not tell you why it arose there, or what it was doing, or why it stuck. The geography narrows down the where and the when. It is silent on the why. And so even the cleanest, most scientific reading of the map, founder population, isolation, dilution by migration, leaves the central question untouched. We can trace the trait's footprints across the globe. We just can't explain the creature that made them. And this, I think, is the right moment to talk about something that I've been dancing around, which is the way this whole topic has taken on a life of its own outside of science. The way Rh-negative blood has become a kind of identity, almost a community for the people who carry it. Because if you go looking, you'll find that there are people who feel a genuine sense of specialness, of being marked, of belonging to a distinct group, simply because of that minus sign on their blood card. And I want to talk about this carefully, because it's one of the most human parts of the whole story. Here's what tends to happen. Somebody is Rh-negative. They learn the basic facts we've been covering, the missing protein, the every other primate has it thing, the pregnancy danger, the Basque clustering, the unexplained survival. And those facts, all true, plant a seed. The seed is, I am different. I am part of a small group that science can't fully explain. And from that seed grows a whole forest of associations, some of which have a little soil of truth under them, and some of which are pure imagination. People start collecting traits they believe are associated with being Rh negative, and you'll see these lists floating around. Claims that Rh negative people are more likely to have certain eye colors, certain physical features, higher intelligence, psychic abilities, sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, lower body temperature, extra vertebrae, you name it. The lists get longer and more dramatic the further you wander from the actual science. Now let me be completely straight with you, because the whole point of this channel is to be straight with you. Almost none of that list holds up. There is no credible scientific evidence that Rh negative people are smarter or psychic or have alien ancestry or run cooler body temperatures or any of the dozens of supposed special traits that get attached to the traits online. Those claims are not supported. They are the human imagination doing what it does with a true mystery, building a personality, a mythology, an identity around a genuine biological fact. And I find that absolutely fascinating, not because the claims are true, but because of what they reveal about us. We take a real, documented, unexplained quirk of biology, and we turn it into a story about who we are. We make it mean something. We make it special, because a meaningless quirk is unsatisfying. But being part of a special, mysterious bloodline that science can't explain, that's a story you can feel good about carrying around in your veins. And here's the thing, I don't want to be too harsh about it because the impulse is completely understandable and it sits right on top of facts that genuinely are strange. The people building these mythologies aren't crazy. They're responding to something real. The Rh negative trait is genuinely unexplained. It is missing from a protein every other primate has. It does cluster in mysterious ancient populations. The pregnancy paradox is a real evolutionary puzzle. So when somebody feels like their blood marks them as part of something we don't understand, well, in the narrowest, most literal sense, they're not entirely wrong. There is something about that blood we don't understand. The error isn't in feeling the mystery. The error is in filling the mystery with made-up specifics, the psychic powers, the alien lineage, the superhuman traits, when the honest answer is still just, we don't know. The mystery is real. The mythology is invented. And the gap between those two things is exactly the territory we've been exploring this whole time. Okay, so let me pull us back to firmer ground and go even deeper into the Neanderthal angle, because I gave it a once-over before, but it deserves a proper excavation, and it connects to one of the most mind-bending facts about who we actually are as a species. So here's where it gets crazy. The story you probably grew up with, the simple version of human origins, is that we, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa, spread out across the world, and that was that. One species, one lineage, climbing steadily up from the apes to us. Clean, linear, a single triumphant march. That story is wrong, or at least it's dramatically incomplete, because the real story of human origins is not a single line. It's a tangled, messy, interbreeding bush. For a long stretch of prehistory, there wasn't just one kind of human walking the earth. There were several. There were us, the Homo sapiens. There were the Neanderthals, stocky and strong and big-brained, who had been living across Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before we ever showed up. They were the established locals, the ones who'd already mastered the Ice Age while our ancestors were still figuring out how to leave Africa. There were the Denisovans, a mysterious group we mostly know from tiny fragments of bone and teeth found in a cave in Siberia, plus the genetic traces they left in living people today. And there were almost certainly other groups too, ghost populations we've detected only as strange signatures in modern DNA. hints of ancestors we have never identified and may never find the bones of. And when our ancestors marched out of Africa and into the territories where these other humans already lived, they didn't just replace them, they mixed with them. The interbreeding I mentioned before wasn't a one-off curiosity. It was a real, recurring feature of how our species spread across the planet. And the proof is sitting in your genome right now. If your ancestry traces to outside Africa, you're carrying somewhere in the range of 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. If you have ancestry from certain parts of Asia and the Pacific, you may also carry Denisovan DNA on top of that. These aren't trace contaminations or rounding errors. These are functional pieces of ancient DNA that in some cases do real things in your body today. Bits of Neanderthal DNA have been linked to aspects of modern immune function, to skin and hair traits, to how our bodies respond to certain conditions, even to subtle things about metabolism and how we handle high altitudes or cold. Your ancient cousins are not just a footnote in your history. They are an active ingredient in your biology. So against that backdrop, the idea that the Rh-negative trait might trace back to one of these archaic human populations stops sounding like science fiction and starts sounding like a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. We already know we absorbed traits from these vanished cousins. We already know our blood, our immune systems, our skin, our metabolism carry their fingerprints. So why not our rhesus status? Why couldn't the missing rhesus protein be a Neanderthal inheritance, or a Denisovan one, or a ghost population one, a relic of a human lineage that wasn't quite the same as the one that became dominant? And I'll give you the honest scorecard, the same as before, because I'm not going to oversell it. The hard genetic evidence that specifically pins the Rh-negative deletion on the Neanderthals is not clean. When scientists have actually examined the rhesus genetics of Neanderthals and Denisovans from the ancient DNA we've recovered, the picture has turned out to be complicated rather than confirming a tidy handoff. There have even been findings suggesting that the blood group situation in those archaic humans was its own complex thing, not a simple template for ours. So I cannot stand here and tell you the Neanderthals were Rh-negative and gave it to us. That would be making stuff up, and we don't do that. What I can tell you is that the broader truth the theory leans on, that we are a hybrid species, a blend of multiple ancient human lineages carrying their genes in our blood right now, that truth is rock solid. And it reframes the entire Rh-negative question. Because in a world where we definitely absorbed DNA from not quite us human cousins, the notion that some of us carry a blood trait inherited from a different branch of the human family is no longer a wild claim. It's a candidate explanation sitting right there on the table, even if we can't yet prove it's the right one. And you can see, can't you, how this is the bridge again, the same bridge I pointed at in the beginning. On one side, you've got bulletproof science. We interbred with archaic humans. We carry their DNA, full stop. Walk across that bridge and you arrive at a reasonable hypothesis. Maybe Rh-negative blood is part of that inheritance. Keep walking past where the evidence supports you and you arrive at the wilder shore. Maybe Rh-negative people are descended from a bloodline that wasn't fully human, a separate kind of being. And from there, it's just a few more steps to the Nephilim and the lost races and the rest of it. Every step on that bridge feels like it follows from the last. The first steps are solid stone. The last ones are mist. And the genius and the danger of this whole topic is that the bridge is continuous. There's no obvious line painted on it that says, science ends here, mythology begins. You have to know where that line is yourself. And now you do. The line is right about where the proof runs out, right where we definitely interbred with Neanderthals, hands off to, and that's specifically why some of us are Rh-negative. One side is fact. The other side is a guess wearing a lab coat. Now, let me take you somewhere I haven't gone yet, because there's an angle to all of this that ties the deep past to the very real present. And it's about what happens when our modern, mixed-up, globalized world collides with a blood system that evolved in isolated populations. Because here's something genuinely consequential that flows directly from everything we've discussed. The geographic distribution of Rh-negative blood creates real medical challenges in a world where people from everywhere now live everywhere. Think about it. We said Rh-negative is around 15% in European-descended populations and around 1% in East Asian populations. Now imagine a city, any major global city, where people of European descent and people of East Asian descent and people of African descent and people of every other descent all live together, fall in love together, have children together, and need medical care together. The blood supply for that city has to serve all of them. And because Rh-negative blood is rare in some of those groups and more common in others, managing the supply gets genuinely tricky. In countries where Rh-negative blood is rare, an Rh-negative person who needs a transfusion can be in real trouble because there simply aren't many compatible donors in the population. Hospitals in those places sometimes have to make special arrangements, maintain rare blood registries, even import blood to handle Rh-negative patients. The ancient geographic pattern of this trait, the one we traced radiating out from the Basques across the whole world, reaches right into a modern hospital and shapes whether there's a compatible bag of blood waiting on the shelf when someone needs it. And it goes deeper than transfusions, back to pregnancy again, in a world that's more mixed than ever before. The pregnancy paradox we talked about, Rh-negative mother, Rh-positive baby, becomes more common, not less, in a globalized world. Because when populations that historically had very different Rh-negative rates mix together, you get more couples where one partner is Rh-negative and the other is Rh-positive than you would in a population that was uniform. More mixed couples means more pregnancies where the mother is Rh-negative and the baby is Rh-positive. Which means the elegant little injection treatment we talked about, the one that diffuses the biological landmine, becomes more important, more widely needed in exactly the kind of mixed, globalized society most of us now live in. The deep, ancient history of this trait, born in isolated populations tens of thousands of years ago, is reaching forward into delivery rooms today, shaping the care that mothers and babies receive right now in real time. The past isn't past, it's in the blood, and the blood is in the delivery room. And I think that's worth dwelling on for a second, because it's easy to treat all this as a fun, abstract puzzle, the missing protein, the wild theories, the ancient cousins, and forget that it's load-bearing in people's actual lives today. Real mothers, right now, are getting that injection because of a quirk of blood that emerged in some ancient population we can't fully identify, for reasons we can't fully explain, that spread in a pattern we can map but not account for. Real people with rare blood types, including those golden blood Rh-null individuals, are quietly serving as global resources or living with the knowledge that an accident could be catastrophic. The mystery isn't just intellectual, it's woven into the practical machinery of keeping human beings alive. And there's something kind of beautiful about that one of the genuinely unexplained things about our species is also one of the things we've learned to manage with such precision and care, even without fully understanding where it came from. We beat rhesus disease without solving the rhesus mystery. We learned to work with the thing before we learned what it was. Now, let me steer us back toward the historical and the strange, because I want to return to those bloodlines, the royal families, the obsession with lineage and purity, and connect it to a broader human pattern. Because the blue blood thing is actually one specific instance of something that humans have done over and over throughout history, and understanding the pattern makes the royal coincidence even more interesting. Here's the pattern. Across cultures, across continents, Across thousands of years, human beings have been obsessed with the idea that bloodlines carry essence, that who your ancestors were is somehow physically present in you, passed down in the blood, determining your nature, your rights, your worth. Kings claimed divine bloodlines to justify their right to rule. Castes and classes were built on the idea that some bloodlines were inherently nobler than others. Entire systems of power, for most of recorded history, rested on the belief that blood carries inheritance in a deeper, almost magical sense. Not just genes, but destiny, virtue, the right to command. And this wasn't seen as mythology by the people who believed it. It was seen as obvious truth, as the natural order of the world. And here's the part that makes it land with the Rh-negative story. For most of that history, people had absolutely no idea what blood actually was at the cellular level. They didn't know about red blood cells or proteins or genes or any of it. The discovery that blood even comes in types, the A, B, O system, didn't happen until the very beginning of the 20th century. The rhesus factor, as we covered, wasn't discovered until 1940. So for thousands of years, all of humanity's intense, civilization-shaping obsession with bloodlines was operating completely blind. They were convinced that blood carried profound differences between people, profound inheritances, without having the faintest scientific basis for it. They just felt it must be true. And then, in the 20th century, science finally opens up the blood and looks inside and discovers that, well, blood actually does come in types, that those types are inherited, that they cluster in certain populations and bloodlines, and that some of those families who are most obsessed with their special blood do in fact carry unusual blood traits. Now, I want to be careful and fair here, the same as before. The fact that royal families carry elevated rates of rare blood traits is, as we discussed, almost certainly explained by inbreeding, by the closed, intermarried gene pools they maintained for the sake of power, not by any genuine specialness of their lineage in the mystical sense they imagined. The science doesn't validate the mythology, it explains it. The blood is unusual because the gene pool was tiny and closed, not because the bloodline was descended from gods or angels or anything else. So the rational story is clear, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But step back and look at the shape of what happened across human history, because it's genuinely poetic and a little eerie, and that's the part worth sitting with. For thousands of years, humans believed, with no evidence, that blood carried deep and meaningful inheritances that varied between bloodlines and made some people fundamentally different from others. Then science arrived and revealed that, in a completely different, literal, biochemical sense than they meant, blood actually does carry inherited differences that vary between bloodlines and populations and can make people, in concrete medical ways, genuinely different from one another. The ancients were wrong about the why and the meaning. They were eerily, accidentally close on the basic fact that blood is not all the same, that it carries inheritance, that it varies in patterns tied to lineage and ancestry. They were chasing a real signal with a completely wrong map. And the Rh-negative trait, sitting there in those royal lines and ancient populations, is one of the places where the wrong old myth and the right new science brush up against each other in a way that gives you that little shiver, the feeling that the old stories were reaching blindly towards something that turned out to be partly, literally, true. And that, I think, is the deepest reason this whole topic refuses to die. It's not really about the protein. The protein is just the seed. The reason Rh-negative blood fascinates people across the entire spectrum, from cautious scientists hunting for the hidden advantage, to communities building identities around their minus sign, to the wildest corners spinning tales of Nephilim and alien bloodlines, is that it sits right at the intersection of two of humanity's oldest obsessions. The first is our obsession with origins. Where did we come from? What are we made of? What's hiding in our deep past? And the second is our obsession with blood as the carrier of identity and inheritance and destiny. Rh-negative blood is a real, documented, scientific mystery that lives exactly where those two obsessions meet. It's a genuine, unanswered question about our origins, written into the blood that we've always believed carries our deepest truths. Of course it drives people wild. It was practically designed to. So let me leave you, at the end of this stretch of the journey, with the state of play, the honest accounting of where we actually stand. We know that 15% of humanity is missing the rhesus protein that every other primate carries. We know the protein isn't useless. It does real work in your red blood cells, which makes its disappearance a genuine trade, not a free quirk. We know the trait clusters in a pattern that radiates from Western Europe and spikes among the ancient, isolated Basques, fading to almost nothing at the far edges of human geography. We know it carries a real reproductive cost through rhesus disease, a cost that should have erased it but somehow didn't. We know we beat that disease with an elegant medical trick, but only in the last 60 years, leaving the deep history survival of the trait completely unexplained. We know we're a hybrid species, carrying the DNA of vanished human cousins, which makes archaic inheritance a live hypothesis, even if it's not proven. And we know that the families who most fervently believed their blood was special turned out, through the cold mechanics of inbreeding, to actually carry unusual blood. That's a lot of knowing. And in the middle of all that knowing, there's still that hole, the why. Why did it vanish? Why did it survive? What did it gain? Where exactly did it come from? We've narrowed the question down with extraordinary precision. We've mapped it, dated it, medicalized it, mythologized it, and we still can't close it. And honestly, that's what makes it one of the most genuinely fascinating things you can carry around in your own body. A question mark, written in blood, that the smartest people on the planet have been staring at for over 80 years and still can't fully answer. And we're not done yet, because there are still more layers to peel back, and the next ones get into some of the strangest territory of all. Okay, so I told you the next layers get into some of the strangest territory of all, and I meant it. But before we wade into the strange, I want to do something that's going to make the strange land even harder. I want to take you all the way back to the very beginning of how humans even discovered that blood could be different from one person to the next. Because here's the thing, for almost the entire history of our species, nobody knew. Nobody had the faintest idea that the red stuff inside one person could be fundamentally incompatible with the red stuff inside another. And the story of how we found that out is a story of horror, accident, and eventually one stubborn genius. And it's the foundation that everything we've talked about sits on top of. So let me explain. Picture the centuries before the 20th century. People understood in a basic way that blood was important, that losing too much of it killed you, that it was somehow connected to life itself. And so, naturally, the idea occurred to some clever and desperate people. If someone is dying because they've lost blood, why not just put more blood into them? Refill the tank. It sounds obvious. It sounds like it should work. And so, going back centuries, there were attempts at blood transfusion. Brave, desperate, and frequently catastrophic attempts. Some of the earliest experiments were genuinely wild. People tried transfusing blood from animals into humans. Sheep blood, calf blood, into sick and dying patients, on the theory that maybe the gentle nature of the lamb would calm a raving madman, or that fresh young animal blood would restore vigor. And the results were exactly as horrifying as you'd expect, if you understand what we now know about blood types and the immune system. Patients would have violent reactions. Their bodies would go into shock. Many died. The whole practice became so dangerous and so controversial that for a long stretch, blood transfusion was actually banned in several places. It was seen as reckless butchery. And the maddening part is that nobody understood why it sometimes seemed to work and sometimes killed. It was a coin flip, and the people flipping the coin had no idea what the coin even was. Even human-to-human transfusion, which came later, and was obviously a better idea than pumping sheep blood into people, was still a deadly gamble. Sometimes you'd transfuse blood from one person to another, and the patient would recover beautifully. Other times, same procedure, same care, the patient would suddenly spike a fever. Their back and chest would seize with pain. Their urine would turn dark. They'd go into shock and they'd die. Same procedure, wildly different outcomes, and no one could predict which way it would go. Imagine being a doctor in that era, watching this, completely unable to explain why the exact same life-saving treatment was sometimes a miracle and sometimes an execution. It must have felt cursed. It must have felt like the gods were just deciding, at random, who lived and who died. And here's where the genius walks in. Remember Karl Landsteiner, the name from Chunk 1, the man who was in that 1940 lab dripping monkey antibodies onto human blood? Well, that 1940 discovery was actually the second act of his career. The first act, the one that won him the Nobel Prize, happened right at the very start of the 20th century, around 1901. And it's the discovery that cracked the whole mystery of why transfusions were a coin flip. Landsteiner took blood from different people, including his own colleagues in the lab and himself, and he started systematically mixing samples together. One person's red cells with another person's serum, the liquid part of the blood. And he watched methodically for the clumping. That same clumping reaction we talked about, the immune system flagging cells as foreign and clotting them together. And what he found was the foundation of everything. He found that human blood wasn't all the same. It came in distinct types. When he mixed certain combinations, nothing happened. The blood stayed smooth, compatible. But when he mixed other combinations, the cells clumped violently together, incompatible, the immune reaction firing. By carefully working through the combinations, he identified the basic groups, what we now call A, B, and O, with the fourth, AB, identified shortly after by others working from his discovery. And suddenly, the curse was explained. Transfusions killed people when the donor's blood type was incompatible with the recipient's, triggering that violent clumping inside the patient's body, clogging their vessels, destroying the cells, sending them into deadly shock. And transfusions saved people when the types were compatible. It wasn't the gods, it wasn't luck, it was blood type. And once you knew the types, you could match donor to recipient and turn the coin flip into a reliable, life-saving procedure. That single discovery is the reason blood transfusion went from reckless butchery to one of the most routine, dependable, life-saving tools in all of medicine. Millions upon millions of lives across the last century saved because one stubborn man mixed blood in test tubes and paid attention to which ones clumped. And I'm telling you all this for a reason, because it sets up the gravity of the rhesus discovery. By 1940, when Landsteiner and Wiener found the rhesus factor, the world had already absorbed the ABO system. Transfusion was working. Doctors thought, more or less, that the blood problem was solved. Match the ABO types and you're good. But then the rhesus discovery revealed that no, there was a whole second layer underneath. Even people with matching ABO types could be incompatible if one was rhesus positive and the other rhesus negative. It was a second hidden code sitting under the first one that nobody had known about. And that's why your blood card has both a letter and a plus or minus. The letter is Landsteiner's first discovery from the start of the century, and the plus or minus is his second discovery from 1940. One man, two discoveries, 4 decades apart, and together they form the entire framework that makes blood transfusion safe to this day. The rhesus mystery, in other words, didn't emerge from some fringe corner of science. It emerged from the absolute center of one of the most important medical achievements in human history. This is not woo. This is the bedrock. And I want you to hold on to that, because it matters for how you think about all the wild theories. When somebody on the strange end of the internet tells you that Rh-negative blood is the sign of an alien bloodline or an ancient hybrid race, They are taking a real, hard, Nobel Prize-grounded piece of medical science and stretching it out to the horizon. The starting material is completely legitimate. That's what makes the stretch so seductive and so important to understand clearly. The blood types are real. The rhesus factor is real. The mystery of its origin is real. Everything past that is where you have to be careful. So now, with that bedrock laid down, let me take you into one of the genuinely stranger corners, the question of what Rh-negative blood might have meant in deep prehistory, before any of this was understood, before any medicine existed to soften its edges. Because here's a thought experiment that I think is genuinely illuminating. Imagine you're living 30,000 years ago. You're in a small band of humans, a few dozen people maybe, moving across an ice age landscape. There's no medicine. There's no understanding of blood. There's just survival, day to day, season to season. And in your band, there's an Rh-negative woman married to or paired with an Rh-positive man. She has her first child, and the child is healthy, wonderful. But then she has her second child, and the baby is born sick, yellow with jaundice, weak, struggling, or stillborn. And then the third the same way. And nobody in the band has any idea why. The woman who could have one healthy child but no more. There would have been no explanation. It would have been understood through the lens of whatever your band believed, a curse, a spirit, the disfavor of some force, bad luck, a mark of something wrong. Now think about what that means across thousands of years, across countless small bands like that one. The Rh-negative women paired with Rh-positive men would have had, on average, fewer surviving children. And yet, and here's the paradox biting down again, harder than ever now that you can picture it in the flesh, the trait survived. Through all of that, through every band where an Rh-negative mother buried her later children, through 50,000 years with no injection, no doctor, no understanding, no mercy. The cold arithmetic should have ground it down, and it didn't. Which means one of two things has to be true. Either the math was somehow being counterbalanced, Rh-negative people were having more surviving children in some other way that made up for the pregnancy losses, some hidden advantage strong enough to win the long game, or the trait kept getting reintroduced and concentrated through founder effects and isolation faster than selection could clear it out. Or, of course, both. The trait fought a 50,000-year war against natural selection in the harshest conditions imaginable with no help, and it's still standing. That is not nothing. That is one of the most quietly remarkable survival stories in human biology, and almost nobody thinks about it that way. And here's a wrinkle that makes the prehistoric picture even more interesting, and it's a real one. The pregnancy danger only kicks in when an Rh-negative mother is carrying an Rh-positive baby, which only happens when she pairs with an Rh-positive man. So now imagine an isolated population where almost everyone is Rh-negative. Like, say, a population approaching that Basque-level concentration, or even higher in some hypothetical isolated group. In a population where most people are Rh-negative, an Rh-negative woman is much more likely to pair with an Rh-negative man. And an Rh-negative mother carrying an Rh-negative baby has no problem at all. No incompatibility, no immune war. Perfectly safe pregnancies every time. Do you see what that means? In an isolated population that's already high in Rh-negative blood, the pregnancy penalty largely disappears because the matches are mostly negative with negative. The trait becomes safe to carry precisely when it's already common. Which means that once a founder population got over some threshold of Rh-negative concentration, the trait could persist and even thrive within that group without paying the reproductive cost at all. The penalty only really bites when Rh-negative people are a minority surrounded by Rh-positive partners. And that, right there, might be one of the best clues we have to the whole survival paradox. The trait may have survived not in spite of being concentrated in isolated populations, but because of it. Isolation didn't just preserve the trait by accident. Isolation may have actively protected the trait from its own downside by ensuring that Rh-negative mothers were mostly pairing with Rh-negative fathers and having safe Rh-negative babies. The Basques, in their mountain stronghold, marrying mostly among themselves for thousands of years, would have been the perfect incubator, high enough in Rh-negative blood that the pregnancy penalty mostly switched off, isolated enough that the trait didn't get diluted away. It's a genuinely elegant idea, and it requires no aliens, no Nephilim, no magic, just population genetics doing what population genetics does. It doesn't fully solve everything, because you still have to explain how the concentration got high enough in the first place to flip the switch. But it's a real scientific handle on a paradox that otherwise seems to defy the rules. And I think it's a beautiful example of how the honest scientific answer, when you actually dig into it, is just as satisfying as any wild theory. Maybe more so, because it actually hangs together. Now let me pivot, because I've been promising you this strange territory, and I keep circling it. So let's actually go in. I want to talk about how Rh-negative blood became entangled with one of the biggest fringe belief ecosystems out there, the whole world of ancient mysteries, lost civilizations, and visitors from elsewhere theories. Because the Nephilim angle I mentioned in Chunk 1 is really just one node in a much bigger web, and understanding the web tells you something important about how human beings process genuine mysteries. Here's the basic shape of the fringe argument, laid out as clearly and fairly as I can put it, because I think you should understand it properly, even though I'm going to push back on it. The argument goes like this. Point 1. Rh-negative blood is missing a protein that every other primate has, which the fringe interpreters take to mean it can't have come from the same evolutionary line as the rest of life on Earth, they say. If we evolved from common primate ancestors, where did this gap come from? Point 2. Rh-negative blood causes the mother's body to reject an Rh-positive baby as foreign, which the fringe interpreters take as evidence that Rh-negative and Rh-positive people are, in some deep sense, different kinds of beings, so different that their own bodies treat each other's offspring as alien. Point 3. The trait clusters in specific ancient bloodlines, like the Basques and the European nobility, which the fringe interpreters take as the surviving traces of a special, separate lineage. And point 4. They tie this all together with ancient texts that speak of beings who came from the sky or hybrids of the divine and the human, like the Nephilim, and they conclude that Rh-negative people are the descendants of those beings, that the minus sign on your blood card is the genetic signature of something that came from beyond, or at least from outside the ordinary human family. Now, I've laid that out as a coherent argument because I respect you enough to give you the real thing rather than a straw man. And I want to walk through, point by point, exactly where it goes wrong, because every single one of those points takes a real fact and twists it. And seeing the twist is genuinely educational. It teaches you how to think. Point 1. The missing protein proves non-earthly origin. Here's the twist. A missing protein doesn't require an alien explanation at all. Genes get switched off, deleted, broken all the time in evolution. It's one of the most ordinary things that happens. We covered it. In most Rh-negative people of European descent, the RHD gene is simply deleted. Deletions happen. They're common. The fact that other primates kept the gene and a chunk of humans lost it tells you a mutation occurred in the human line after we split from the other primates, which is precisely what you'd expect from ordinary evolution. A lost gene is evidence of normal evolutionary tinkering, not evidence of a visitor from the stars. The fringe reads a mundane deletion as a cosmic fingerprint. That's the twist. Point 2. The pregnancy rejection proves Rh-negative and Rh-positive are different kinds of beings. Here's the twist. The immune system rejecting a foreign protein is the single most ordinary thing an immune system does. Your body rejects transplanted organs from other humans. Your body can react to all kinds of proteins from other completely human people. The mother's reaction to the rhesus protein isn't evidence of a deep species difference. It's the immune system doing its absolute most basic job, which is reacting to a protein it hasn't been trained to recognize as self. By the fringe logic, anyone who's ever rejected a transplant would be a different species from the donor, which is obviously absurd. The twist is taking a routine immune response and inflating it into a metaphysical divide. Point 3. The clustering in special bloodlines proves a separate lineage. We've already dismantled this one thoroughly. The clustering is explained by founder effects, isolation, and inbreeding by population genetics, the same forces that concentrate any rare trait in any closed group. The Basques cluster because they're isolated, the nobility cluster because they intermarried. There's nothing left over that requires a special lineage. The twist is treating ordinary genetic concentration as the mark of a chosen bloodline. And point 4, the ancient texts. Here's the twist, and it's the biggest one. Ancient texts are extraordinary windows into how our ancestors understood their world, their fears, their sense of the divine. They're priceless as human documents. But they are not genetic records. They were written by people who had no concept of blood types, no concept of proteins or genes, no microscopes, nothing. To take a poetic, mythological, spiritual text about beings of old and read modern blood science into it is to project our knowledge backward onto people who couldn't possibly have meant any such thing. The Nephilim, whatever the texts meant by them, were not making a statement about the rhesus factor, because the concept of the rhesus factor would not exist for thousands of years. The twist is forcing a modern scientific frame onto an ancient spiritual one and pretending the match was always there. So every point in the fringe argument is the same move repeated. Take a real fact, strip away the ordinary explanation, and replace it with the most extraordinary one available. And here's the thing I really want you to take away from this, because it's worth more than any single fact about blood. That move, take a real anomaly, ignore the boring explanation, leap to the spectacular one, is the engine behind an enormous amount of misinformation about absolutely everything, not just blood. Once you can see the move clearly in the Rh negative case, where the real science is so well documented, you can spot it everywhere. The anomaly is usually real, the leap is the problem, and the boring explanation is usually both true and, honestly, more interesting once you actually understand it. There is no force on Earth more reliably underestimated than a founder effect. But, and I have to be fair here, because being fair is the whole point, I understand completely why the fringe version is more emotionally satisfying. Of course it is. Which would you rather be? A person carrying a deleted gene that drifted to high frequency in an isolated population through ordinary population genetics, or the descendant of beings who came from beyond, marked in your very blood as part of a secret lineage that the world doesn't understand? The second one is a better story. It makes you special. It makes the mystery mean something about you, personally. And humans are storytelling creatures who crave meaning the way we crave food and water. So I don't sneer at the people who believe the wild version. I get the pull. I just want you to be able to see the machinery so that you can feel the pull and still keep your feet on the ground. You can love the mystery without swallowing the myth. That's the whole trick of thinking clearly, holding the wonder and the skepticism at the same time, in the same hand. Now, let me give you something that the fringe folks almost never mention, because it complicates their story in a way they don't like, and it's a genuinely fascinating piece of real science. We've been talking about Rh negative as if it's one clean thing. You've got the protein or you don't. But the reality is more textured than that, and the texture is revealing. The rhesus blood group system isn't just one protein with a simple on-off switch. It's actually a whole family of related antigens, with the D antigen being the big, important one we've been focused on. The D is what the plus or minus mostly refers to. But there are others in the system, with letters like C, C, E, and E, and they combine in different patterns in different people. The rhesus system is one of the most complex blood group systems we know of, with dozens of recognized variations. So the simple binary of positive or negative is really a convenient summary of something much richer and more intricate going on underneath. And why does that matter for our story? Because complexity is the fingerprint of ordinary evolution, not of a clean, designed, separate origin. If Rh-negative people were some distinct, separate lineage with a single special difference, you'd expect a clean, simple difference. Instead, what you find is exactly the kind of messy, gradual, multi-part variation that evolution produces when it tinkers with a system over a long time. Variants and subvariants and partial expressions. The genetic equivalent of a much-edited manuscript with crossings out and margin notes and different drafts layered on top of each other. The rhesus system looks like what it is: an old, complicated piece of biology that's been mutating and recombining and drifting across populations for a very long time. There are even people with weak or partial versions of the D antigen, not fully positive, not fully negative, but somewhere in between, expressing just a little bit of the protein or a modified form of it. That fuzzy in-between zone is the opposite of what you'd expect from a clean dividing line between two kinds of beings. It's smudged, gradual, and complicated, which is to say, it's biology. Real biology is almost never clean. The cleanness people imagine is the tell that they're looking at a story rather than at the actual data. Let me dwell on those partial D folks for a second, because they're a beautiful little wrecking ball aimed straight at the binary thinking. There are people whose blood is genuinely ambiguous. They carry a version of the D protein that's weak or incomplete or structurally altered, such that different tests might classify them differently, and they might be typed as positive in one situation and negative in another, depending on how sensitive the test is. In transfusion medicine and in pregnancy care, these in-between cases require careful handling precisely because they don't fit the neat box. Now, if the universe were divided cleanly into Rh-positive humans and Rh-negative special lineage beings, where exactly would these in-between people fall? They wouldn't make sense. But in the real evolutionary population genetics picture, they make perfect sense. They're just points along a continuous spectrum of genetic variation in an old and complicated system. The existence of the in-between people is, quietly, one of the strongest arguments that the whole two kinds of humans framing is an illusion. There aren't two kinds. There's a spectrum, with most people clustered near the two ends, and a smudge of fascinating cases in the middle. That's not a border between species. That's just the ordinary, beautiful messiness of inheritance. Now, I want to come back around to the deep time question one more time, because there's an angle on the origin of the Rh-negative trait that I think is the most intellectually honest place to land, and it's worth spelling out properly. The honest truth is that the precise origin of the Rh-D deletion, when it happened, in what population, why it spread, is genuinely not fully resolved by science. And I want to be clear that not fully resolved is different from mysterious in a spooky way. It's not that the answer is hidden behind some cosmic veil. It's that the events in question happened tens of thousands of years ago in populations that left no written records, and reconstructing the exact genetic history of a single deletion across deep prehistory is just genuinely hard. We're working with the genetic traces left in living people and the fragmentary ancient DNA we've managed to recover, and we're trying to run the movie backward. That's incredibly difficult, and the picture is still coming into focus. Scientists have estimates and models and competing hypotheses, but no single airtight, universally agreed account of exactly where and when and why the Rh-negative trait arose and spread. And I think that's actually the perfect note to sit on for a moment, because it captures the real texture of the mystery. It's not that science has thrown up its hands and declared the thing inexplicable. It's that this is a hard problem at the frontier of what genetics can reconstruct about our deep past, and the answer is being assembled piece by piece as our ability to read ancient DNA improves. Every year, we get better at extracting and sequencing DNA from ancient bones. Every year, we add more ancient individuals to the picture of what human populations looked like genetically across prehistory. And so the Rh-negative origin question isn't a permanent, sealed mystery. It's a question that's slowly, steadily getting answered, the way real science answers things, with more data and better tools, and incremental progress rather than a single dramatic revelation. The fringe wants a revelation. Science offers a reconstruction. And the reconstruction, while less exciting than a thunderbolt of cosmic truth, has the considerable advantage of actually being true, or at least of getting truer over time. But here's what I find genuinely moving about all of this, and I want to share it because I think it's the real heart of why this topic matters, beyond just being a cool fact to know. When you carry an Rh-negative blood type, or honestly, any blood type, you are carrying a physical record of your deep ancestry. That minus sign isn't just a medical detail, it's a thread that connects you directly, biochemically, to populations that lived tens of thousands of years ago. The blood in your veins right now contains the literal genetic legacy of ancient people you'll never know, who lived through ice ages, who migrated across continents, who survived plagues and famines and dangers we can barely imagine, and who passed down through an unbroken chain of parents and children stretching back into the deep dark of prehistory, the exact genetic instructions that determine whether your blood clumps or doesn't clump when it meets a particular antibody. You are the living end of a chain that runs back tens of thousands of years. And that's true whether you're positive or negative, but the negative folks just happen to be carrying a thread that's especially old, especially concentrated in certain ancient lineages, and especially mysterious. That's not woo, that's just the literal scientific truth of what it means to inherit a blood type. Your blood is a time capsule. Every one of us is walking around with a message from the deep past written into our cells, and most of us never even glance at it. And that ties back beautifully to why the ancients were so obsessed with blood and bloodlines in the first place, which we talked about. They couldn't read the message. They had no microscopes, no genetics, no idea what was actually in the blood, but they sensed, correctly, that blood carried inheritance, that it connected the living to the dead, that it was the physical medium through which the past reached into the present. They were right about that core intuition. They just couldn't read the specifics. And now we can. We can read the message. We can look at a blood type and trace, partially, the ancient populations it came from. We have, in a real sense, finally learned to read the thing that humanity always felt was sacred and meaningful and never understood. And what we found when we finally learned to read it was a genuine mystery sitting right there in the text. A missing protein, a paradoxical survival, a strange geographic signature. The ancients were right that blood holds secrets. They just didn't know that one of the secrets would turn out to be a puzzle we still can't fully solve, even with all our modern tools. So let me draw this stretch of the journey toward a close by stacking up where we now stand, because we've added a lot of new layers in this chunk. We've seen that the entire science of blood types was born out of centuries of deadly, baffling transfusion failures and cracked open by one stubborn genius, Karl Landsteiner, whose first discovery at the start of the 20th century gave us A, B, and O, and whose second discovery in 1940 gave us the rhesus factor, which means the Rh mystery sits at the absolute bedrock of legitimate medical science, not at its fringes. We've imagined the brutal reality of being Rh negative in prehistory, with no medicine and no understanding. And we've seen how that makes the trait's 50,000-year survival genuinely astonishing. We've found a real, elegant, scientific handle on the survival paradox. The idea that in isolated, high Rh negative populations like the Basques, the pregnancy penalty largely switches off because negative pairs with negative, so isolation may have actively protected the trait from its own downside. We've laid out the full fringe argument fairly and then dismantled it point by point, exposing the single, repeated move at its core. Take a real anomaly, skip the boring explanation, leap to the spectacular one. We've discovered that the rhesus system isn't a clean binary at all, but a complex family of antigens with smudgy in-between cases that quietly demolish the two kinds of humans idea. And we've landed on the honest truth that the precise origin of the trait is a hard, frontier problem that science is slowly, genuinely solving, rather than a sealed, cosmic secret. And through all of it, that central hole is still there, the why, but notice how much smaller and more precise it's gotten. We started with, nobody can explain anything about this, and we've narrowed it down to a specific, well-defined frontier question. Exactly when and where did the RHD deletion arise? And exactly what combination of drift, founder effects, isolation, and possible hidden advantages allowed it to survive and concentrate the way it did? That's not a mystical void anymore. That's a research program. And there's something deeply satisfying about watching a spooky, wide-open mystery get steadily boxed in by careful thinking, until what's left is a sharp, answerable question. That's what understanding actually feels like. Not a thunderclap of revelation, a slow, patient narrowing of the unknown. But we're still not done, because there's one more region of this map I haven't fully taken you into. The place where all of this collides with the present and the future, with what we're learning right now from ancient DNA, with what it means for medicine going forward, and with the deepest question of all, which is what the Rh negative mystery ultimately tells us about what kind of creature a human being actually is. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Okay, so I left you standing at the edge of the present, looking forward. And I told you we'd get into what we're learning right now, from ancient DNA, from modern medicine, and ultimately from the deepest question of all, which is what this whole Rh negative business tells us about what a human being actually is. So let's finish the journey, and I want to start with the thing that, more than anything else, is quietly rewriting our understanding of where we came from: the revolution in ancient DNA. Here's something that genuinely sounds like science fiction, but is rock-solid reality. We can now extract DNA from human remains that are tens of thousands of years old. Bones, teeth, especially a dense little bone in the inner ear that turns out to be one of the best preservers of ancient genetic material in the entire body. Researchers can take these ancient fragments and, using techniques that have exploded in power just in the last couple of decades, they can read the genetic code of people who died long, long before any history was written. We're talking about reading the genomes of individuals who lived during the Ice Age, who hunted mammoths, who painted caves, who lived and died in a world with no metal, no writing, no cities. We can now look at their actual DNA. Let that sink in for a second, because it is one of the most astonishing scientific capabilities humanity has ever developed, and it happened basically within living memory. For your entire ancestral history, the deep past was silent. Bones told you a little about shape and size, but the actual genetic story was locked away forever. And now, the lock is broken. The dead are speaking, in the language of their own DNA. And this revolution is directly relevant to our mystery because it's the single best tool we have for finally cracking the origin of the Rh negative trait. Remember, the big unresolved question we narrowed it down to is, exactly when and where did the RhD deletion arise, and how did it spread and concentrate? Well, ancient DNA is exactly how you answer a question like that. As researchers sequence more and more ancient individuals from across Europe and Asia and beyond, they can start to look directly at the rhesus genetics of people who lived 10, 20, 30,000 years ago. They can ask, was this Ice Age hunter Rh negative? Was this early farmer? When you map the trait across hundreds of ancient genomes spread across time and geography, you start to see the actual history of the trait unfold. When it appears, where it's concentrated, how it moves as populations migrate and mix. It's like having a time-lapse camera pointed at the spread of the trait across the deep past. And every year, that picture gets sharper, because every year there are more ancient genomes in the database. Now, what's already emerged from this revolution in the broader story of European ancestry is genuinely mind-bending, and it reframes everything we've said about the Basques and the geographic clustering. Because here's what ancient DNA has revealed about Europe. The people living in Europe today are not the simple descendants of one ancient population that's been sitting there since the Ice Age. Europe was settled in waves. First, there were the ancient hunter-gatherers, the people who'd been there since the last Ice Age. Then, starting roughly 10,000 years ago, came waves of early farmers spreading out of the Near East, bringing agriculture and largely replacing or absorbing the hunter-gatherers. And then, a few thousand years later, came another massive wave, pastoralist peoples sweeping in from the steppes of the East, who again transformed the genetic makeup of the entire continent. Modern Europeans are a blend of these three major ancestral streams, mixed in different proportions in different places. The map of Europe isn't one people, it's a palimpsest, layer over layer over layer of different populations, each one washing over the last. And that completely transforms how you should think about the Basques and their 30% Rh negative blood. Because if the Basques are, as the genetics increasingly suggests, an unusually well-preserved pocket of an earlier ancestral layer, people who held on to more of the older European ancestry, while the rest of the continent got overwritten by later waves, then their high Rh negative rate isn't some spooky anomaly, it's a window. It's a glimpse of what an earlier European population looked like before the later waves came through and diluted the trait. The Basques would be, in effect, a living preservation of an older genetic snapshot, and their elevated Rh negative blood would be telling us that the trait was more common in that earlier layer of European ancestry. The dilution we see as you travel east and across the rest of Europe would then be the signature of those later migration waves, the farmers and the steppe pastoralists, bringing in more Rh-positive blood and washing the trait down to the 15% average we see today, except in the isolated pockets like the Basque Country, where the old layer survived more intact. Do you see how clean that is? Do you see how the ancient DNA revolution takes the single most mysterious fact in this whole story, the Basque 30%, the signature of something we don't understand, and starts to actually explain it, not with aliens or hybrids or Nephilim, but with the real, documented, layered history of how Europe was actually peopled? The signature of something we don't understand is increasingly becoming the signature of something we're starting to understand quite well. The deep population history of a continent, written in waves, preserved in pockets, readable at last through ancient DNA. The mystery isn't being deepened by the new science, it's being solved by it. Slowly, carefully, one ancient genome at a time. And I want to be honest and precise here, the way I've tried to be the whole way through. We don't have the complete, final, every detail nailed down account yet. The exact origin and timing of the RhD deletion is still being worked out. But the trajectory is unmistakable. We are moving from nobody can explain why it vanished toward here is the population history that produced the pattern we see. And that trajectory matters because it tells you which direction the truth is flowing. It's flowing toward ordinary, profound, beautifully complicated population genetics and away from the spectacular fringe explanations. Every new ancient genome makes the founder effect and migration story stronger and the alien bloodline story weaker. The data has a direction, and the direction is toward us being exactly what we are, a deeply mixed, much migrated, endlessly recombined species whose blood carries the layered fingerprints of everyone who came before. Now let me turn from the deep past to the near future, because there's a whole frontier of where this is heading in medicine, and it's genuinely exciting. We talked about how we beat rhesus disease with that elegant injection in the late 1960s, but the management of Rh status is still getting better, still getting smarter, and it tells you something hopeful about where we're going. For instance, here's a genuinely cool advance. It's now possible, through a simple blood test on a pregnant woman, to determine the blood type of her unborn baby without any invasive procedure at all. How? Because during pregnancy, small fragments of the baby's DNA circulate in the mother's bloodstream. So you can take a sample of the mother's blood, fish out those tiny fragments of fetal DNA, and read whether the baby has the RhD gene, whether the baby is Rh positive or Rh negative, all from a simple, safe blood draw. And why does that matter? Because if you can find out early that an Rh negative mother is carrying an Rh negative baby, then you know there's no incompatibility risk at all, and she doesn't need the preventive injection. And if the baby is Rh positive, you know to give the treatment and watch carefully. It's a way of targeting the medicine precisely to the pregnancies that actually need it, sparing everyone else. That's the kind of quiet, elegant progress that doesn't make headlines but improves real lives, knowing the baby's blood type from a drop of the mother's blood, months before birth, with no risk to anyone. And think about the broader arc here, because it's kind of beautiful. For tens of thousands of years, the Rh negative pregnancy was an invisible killer that no one could see or understand. Then, in the 20th century, we finally understood the mechanism. Then we developed a treatment to prevent the tragedy. And now we're developing tools to predict early and non-invasively exactly which pregnancies are at risk so we can target the treatment precisely. We've gone in a few generations from total helplessness to near total mastery of a problem that haunted our species for its entire history. We still can't explain perfectly why the trait exists, but we have completely tamed its most dangerous consequence. That gap between not fully understanding the origin and yet completely managing the danger is itself a profound statement about how modern medicine works. You don't always need to know why something is the way it is in order to learn to handle it with extraordinary skill. We mastered the dragon before we found out where it came from. There's even active research into other ways of handling rhesus incompatibility and into the broader frontier of being able to modify and engineer blood. Scientists have been working on ways to potentially convert blood from one type to another using enzymes that strip off the antigen markers, which could one day help with blood shortages by turning more blood into universal donor blood. We're not all the way there for the rhesus system, but the very fact that researchers are now thinking about engineering the antigens on red blood cells tells you how far we've come. We started this story with people dying because they didn't even know blood came in types. We're ending it with scientists figuring out how to deliberately rewrite the molecular labels on blood cells. From total ignorance to molecular engineering in a little over a century. That's the actual arc of this story, and it's a lot more impressive than any tale about ancient astronauts. Okay, so now let me pull all the way back, all 4 chunks of this journey, and ask the biggest question, the one I promised you we'd end on. What does the Rh-negative mystery ultimately tell us about what a human being is? Because I think when you sit with everything we've covered, it actually delivers a genuinely profound answer. And it's not the answer the fringe wants, but it's far more beautiful than theirs. Here's the thing. The fringe version of this story wants humanity to be split, to be two kinds of beings, the ordinary and the special, the earthly and the otherworldly, divided by a line written in blood. It's a story about separation, about some people being fundamentally apart from and above the rest. And I understand the appeal of that story. But everything we've actually learned points in precisely the opposite direction. The real story of human blood and of human origins is not a story of separation. It's a story of mixing, of blending, of relentless, continuous, beautiful recombination. We are a species woven together from countless ancient populations, carrying Neanderthal DNA and Denisovan DNA, and the genes of ghost populations we can't even name, blended across migration after migration, wave upon wave. Our blood, a layered record of every people who ever loved across a boundary and had children together. The Rh-negative trait isn't a wall separating two kinds of humans. It's just one more thread in an enormous tapestry that connects all of us back to a shared, tangled, magnificent past. And here's the part that I find genuinely moving. That in-between zone we talked about, the people with weak or partial D, the smudgy cases that don't fit neatly into positive or negative, that's not a glitch in the story. That's the whole truth of the story in miniature. There is no clean line. There never was. Humanity is a spectrum, a continuum, a gradient with no sharp borders, and the closer you look, the more the supposed dividing lines dissolve into smudges and overlaps and exceptions. The very feature that the fringe points to as proof that we're divided turns out, when you actually examine it closely, to be proof that we're connected. That the categories we draw are convenient approximations laid over a reality that is fundamentally continuous and shared. Your blood type isn't a tribal banner separating you from other humans. It's a coordinate on a vast shared map of human genetic variation. And every coordinate on that map is connected to every other one by an unbroken web of ancestry running back to the same deep source. So when you look at that little plus or minus on your blood card now, and I hope you look at it differently than you did when this started, I want you to see what it really is. It's not a mark of being special or separate or chosen. It's something better than that. It's a message from your ancestors. It's a fragment of deep history that you carry in every drop of your blood. It's a thread that connects you to Ice Age hunters and ancient farmers and steppe wanderers and isolated mountain peoples and the whole vast, mixed, migrating story of humanity. It's a genuine, real, still not fully solved scientific mystery that the smartest people on the planet are actively unraveling right now, with ancient DNA and clever blood tests and patient, careful science. And it's a reminder that the truth, the real truth, the documented, hard-won, ordinary yet astonishing truth is almost always more interesting than the fantasy if you're just willing to actually understand it. Let me give you the final tally, the whole thing in one breath, because you've earned it after this journey. Around 15% of humanity is walking around missing the rhesus protein that every other primate on Earth carries. It was discovered in 1940 when antibodies from rhesus monkey blood lit up 85% of human samples and left the other 15% invisible. It clusters strangely across the world, spiking to nearly 30% among the ancient isolated Basques, whose language is related to nothing else on Earth, and fading to around 1% in East Asia. It carries a brutal reproductive cost through rhesus disease, where an Rh-negative mother's body can attack her own Rh-positive baby. A cost so severe the trait should have been erased by evolution. Yet it survived 50,000 years with no medicine at all. The wildest theories run from Neanderthal inheritance to plague survivors, to ancient bloodlines that weren't fully human, to the Nephilim of old texts, to the unusual blood of Europe's royal families. And the real explanation, the one the actual evidence keeps pointing toward, is a magnificent tangle of ordinary forces, a gene deletion, founder effects, isolation that may have switched off the very penalty that should have killed the trait, layered migration waves washing across a continent, and a deep population history that ancient DNA is finally, slowly, letting us read for the first time. Every single one of those facts is real. Not one of them is invented. And together, they make up one of the most genuinely fascinating, unsolved, but being solved puzzles in all of human biology. And you know what the strangest part is? After all of that, after the monkeys and the Nobel Prizes and the Ice Age mothers and the Basques and the royals and the ancient DNA, the honest scientific answer to why did the rhesus protein vanish from 15% of us is still, at its absolute core, not completely nailed down. We've narrowed it from a vast, spooky void to a sharp, answerable frontier question. But the final piece isn't fully in place yet, which means that right now, today, you are living through the era in which this mystery is actually being solved. You're not hearing about an answer that was figured out long ago. You're watching it happen, in real time, as the ancient genomes pile up and the picture sharpens. And there's something genuinely thrilling about that, about carrying, in your own veins, a question that humanity is, at this very moment, in the middle of answering. So that's the story of Rh-negative blood, the secret, not really superpower, the missing protein, the trait that broke the rules and survived anyway, the mystery that turned out to be a window into the entire mixed-up, migrated, magnificent history of what we are. It's a reminder that the most ordinary-looking detail, a single character on a card you got at a blood drive, can open up into something vast if you're just curious enough to follow it down. Every plus, every minus, every drop of blood in every one of us is a tiny chapter of a story that runs back tens of thousands of years and is still, even now, being written and read at the same time. And honestly, I think that's a far stranger and more wonderful thing than any tale about ancestors from the stars. The truth was hiding in your own blood the whole time, and it turned out to be a story about all of us, together, all the way down. Thanks for coming this far down the rabbit hole with me. If your blood card suddenly looks a lot more interesting than it did an hour ago, good. That was the whole point. Now go look at it. I'll catch you in the next one.